It's late in the winter, and you're done with it. The sky's been gray for weeks. You wake up in the dark, you come home in the dark, and somewhere in the back of your mind, a small, quiet voice keeps asking the same thing: is this ever actually going to end? For you, it ends. Spring is coming. The calendar guarantees it. But imagine that voice never got an answer. Imagine the cold just stayed. Not for a season. Not for one bad year. For longer than you'd been alive. For longer than your grandparents had been alive. A winter that outlasted memory itself. That actually happened. More than once. And the people who lived through it weren't just enduring a rough patch, they were being reshaped by it. Some of the most ordinary things you own: the coat in your closet, the roof over your head. Maybe even the bread on your table traced straight back to ancestors who stared at a frozen world and simply refused to die in it. So let's talk about what ancient humans actually did when winter never ended. Start with the obvious answer. Fire, and yes, fire-mattered humans had been taming it for hundreds of thousands of years before any of this. A fire pushes back the dark, cooks the food, keeps the wolves at the edge of the light. But here's the problem. Fire is a spot. It warms the half of you that faces it and lets the other half freeze. You can't wear a fire. You can't take it hunting. You can't wrap a sleeping child in it. Fire alone does not get a naked tropical ape through an ice age. Something else had to happen. And that something is so unremarkable, you probably have 20 of them in a drawer right now. The needle. In a cave called Denisova, high in the mountains of Siberia, archaeologists pulled a sewing needle out of the ground made of bird bone, polished smooth, with a carefully drilled eye at one end. It is roughly 50,000 years old, the oldest eyed needle ever found. And it changes everything, because a needle isn't just a tool. A needle is an idea. Before the needle, you could drape a hide over your shoulders and hope. After the needle, you could cut skins into shapes and stitch them into something that actually fit: sleeves, hoods, leggings, seams that trapped a layer of warm air against your body. That's not clothing. That's a portable climate. Suddenly a human being could carry a pocket of summer into the heart of winter and walk straight into places that had been killing us for millions of years. You want to see how good they got at it? Go to Sungir in Russia, a couple 100 kilometers east of Moscow. Around 4,000 years ago, someone was buried there. And from the way the grave goods lie, we can reconstruct almost exactly what they were wearing. Thousands of tiny beads, each carved from mammoth ivory, arranged in neat rows across the entire body, a fitted cap, a jacket, trousers, moccasins. One young person was laid to rest wearing thousands of them. Now think about the labor. Careful experiments suggest each of those beads took close to an hour to carve. That's thousands of hours of work sewn into a single outfit during an ice age, when every hour of daylight was survival itself. These were not desperate people barely clinging on. These were people who had beaten the cold so thoroughly they had time left over to make it beautiful. But you can't wear your way through everything. When the wind is tearing heat off an open, frozen plain, you need walls. And here's where it gets interesting, because they built those walls out of the one thing the frozen world had in staggering supply. Mammoths. At a site called Mezerik in Ukraine, archaeologists uncovered the remains of houses about 15,000 years old. Built almost entirely from mammoth bone, not a handful of bones, hundreds of them per dwelling. Jawbones stacked in interlocking, deliberate patterns to form the walls. Tusks arched over the entrance. A single one of these homes used the bones of dozens of mammoths and would have weighed several tons. These weren't tents you fold up and carry. These were permanent, engineered, planned, a structure built to be lived in through winter after winter after winter. The endless cold didn't scatter these people into the wind. It made them dig in and build. And inside those homes, life was far more sophisticated than the word cavemen ever lets you imagine. At Dolní Vistanis, in what's now the Czech Republic, researchers found small pieces of fired clay stamped 26,000 years ago with the unmistakable pattern of woven textiles, cloth, cordage, maybe netting. People weren't only draped in raw fur, they were weaving. In the depth of an ice age, someone sat beside a fire and made fabric. So now you've got the whole kit. Fire, fitted, tailored clothing. Mammoth bone houses. Woven cloth. You'd think that would be enough to handle anything the cold could throw at them. And for a while, as the last great ice age finally loosened its grip, it was. The world was warming. The glaciers were pulling back. Things were, at long last, getting easier. And then, around 12,900 years ago, winter came back, not gradually. Fast over the span of perhaps a single lifetime, temperatures across the northern world crashed back down toward ice age levels. Scientists call it the Younger Dryas. And here is the part that stops you cold. It didn't last a year. It didn't last a decade. It lasted around 1,200 years. 12 centuries of returned winter. Sit with that for a second. Every person born into the Younger Dryas lived their entire life, grew old, and died inside a cold that had begun before their great-great-grandparents and would not lift until long after their descendants were gone. For those people, winter genuinely never ended. It wasn't a season. It was simply the world. Now here's the part almost nobody mentions. That 1,000-year winter may be the very thing that invented civilization. Right before it struck, in the Middle East, there were people we call the Natufians. They'd been doing well settling into villages, gathering wild grains, comfortable enough to stay in one place without ever needing to farm. Then the Younger Dryas slammed the door. The wild plants they leaned on began to fail. The easy abundance dried up and blew away. And they faced a choice. Scatter back into small, wandering bands and hope, or take the food supply into their own hands. Some of them, it seems, began deliberately planting and tending the very grains they had once simply collected. Not because farming was easier. Farming is backbreaking, relentless work. But because the endless winter had made the old, easy way impossible. We can't prove the cold alone lit that spark. The birth of agriculture was tangled up with population pressure, culture, and a dozen other forces, and honest researchers still argue about the weight of each one. But the timing is haunting. Right as the longest winter in human memory tightened its grip. People in more than one corner of the earth began, independently, to farm. The bread on your table may be something your ancestors invented, not in a moment of comfort, but in the teeth of a cold that simply would not quit. So step back and look at what that frozen world actually built. The coat you pull on against the wind is the distant descendant of a 50,000-year-old needle in a Siberian cave. The solid walls around you are the descendant of a mammoth bone house on a frozen steppe. The whole habit of settling down, storing food, and farming the land the foundation of nearly everything in the world you live in may have been forged by ancestors who looked at a winter with no end in sight and decided to outlast it anyway. So the next time, it's late February, and the sky has been gray for weeks, and that's small. Quiet voice starts asking whether this is ever going to end. Remember that your ancestors asked the exact same question. And remember that for some of them, the honest answer was no. Not in their lifetime. Not for their children. And they turned around and built a world anyway. That's not just survival. That's the most human thing there is, to stand in front of a frozen, endless dark. And start making something